Thanks for coming. Today we have Edward J. Epstein, an investigative journalist with multiple books to his name, including the latest one. We're here to discuss how America lost its secrets. Edward Snowden's A Man and the Theft. So without much further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Epstein to give you the sort of sense of what his book is about. Then we'll do some moderated Q&A from the audience and take your questions.
Yay, I'll come to the bottom. Thank you for coming. I had problems getting in myself through Joe's restaurant, so I hope the Secret Service is letting people in. A subject of some interest to me is how America keeps its secrets as well as loses it. To understand the rise in Russian aggressive intrusions in cyberspace, such as the recent hacking of the 2016 election, it's necessary to also understand the decline of our own capabilities due to the massive theft of communications intelligence by Edward Snowden in June 2013. For the past 3 years, most of the media has uncritically accepted a narrative supplied by a single and self-interested source. To make matters worse, this source, Edward Snowden, is under the protection of the Russian government in Moscow and, of course, the perpetrator of the theft. The narrative began when he made a pit stop in Hong Kong, a very famous pit stop, and made a video, and was further honed in Moscow. If any of you have seen Oliver Stone's movie Snowden, you're seeing this narrative in its final iteration and ultimate form. Despite the fact that there is no independent verification, many journalists endlessly repeat the narrative as if it's gospel truth. It isn't. A key part of the narrative, and the part that interests me the most, is that Snowden gave all his secrets on a thumb drive to journalists while he was still in Moscow, and therefore had nothing to give the Russians when he proceeded on to Moscow. This is demonstrably false. A copy of the thumb drive was examined by British intelligence in August of 2013 when a courier taking this copy of the thumb drive from Berlin, where Laura Poitras was based, to Rio de Janeiro, where Glenn Greenwald was based. These are the two journalists who were originally in contact with him. This was surreptitiously examined, as I said, and was found to contain 58,000 documents. Now, this sounds like an impressive number, 58,000 intelligence documents, but it's only a minute fraction of what he actually took from the NSA. He removed 1.5 million documents. Let me repeat, removed, not sorted through, not copied, not touched, but removed 1.5 digital copies of the SCI, top secret documents. How do we know this? The House Permanent Select Intelligence Committee issued a report declassified on December 22nd, 2016, which states that 1.5 million documents were removed. How does the House committee know it? Well, unlike journalists, or unlike ordinary people, the House committee has access to the damage assessment reports done by the NSA, the CIA, and the Department of Defense, because it's their oversight committee. I should add, this report was a unanimous report signed by all the Democrats on it, as well as the Republicans. So then you might ask, well, you know, in this digital age, when we're talking about copies, not sheets of paper, how did the damage assessment done by the Department of Defense mainly, how did they find out how many documents were actually removed? The answer is Snowden, the place he worked, had what's called a thin computer that had no ports, no storage capabilities, basically a workstation. He transferred the data, all in a matter of a few days, first to a server at the NSA, to the directory of the server, and then to another computer located about 15 miles away at the same Wheeler base in Hawaii, where then he somehow went to and made his own external data, could take thumb drives out or whatever. So they could, from the server and the logs on the server, they could see the quantity of documents he took. From the actual compartments where they were stored, they actually could identify the documents. It took the Department of Defense nearly a year, 250 intelligence officers working in 3 shifts around the clock to basically sort through these 1.5 million documents. They were not only NSA documents, CIA documents, a smaller amount, but there were 900,000 Pentagon documents, mainly concerned with the Cyber Command, which was newly created actually just a year before in 2012, where all the military services, how they're going to combat defensively and offensively cyber threats. So all this was gone. Of course, you know, quantity is totally misleading. You can have 1 million documents and they could be absolutely worthless past documents. Quality is what matters. One single file he took, which was a database, was identified by Rick Leggett, the deputy director of the NSA and the man who did the damage assessment, or headed the team that did the damage assessment. This single document contained what Leggett called the keys of the kingdom. Why? Well, the NSA is a service organization. It services all the other members, the other 16 members of the intelligence community. So if the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the CIA, the Coast Guard, whoever, need information from a foreign source, need to fill a gap in their own coverage, they make a request to the NSA that they need interception of this, or they need to crack into this cable or whatever. These requests, 31,000 pages of them, were in this database that Snowden took. As Leggett explains, from this database alone, an adversary would know not only what we know, but much more important, what we don't know, what isn't being covered, or what we need to know. All gone, a disastrous loss and a paralyzing loss. No one knows the ultimate fate of this material. Whether China got it, Russia got it, no one got it. That they don't know. But when you have any loss of this kind of communications intelligence, it's compromised. The moment it leaves its secure area, you consider it compromised. What that means is you close down your networks, you roll up your sources, you change your methods, because otherwise they can be used to plant information and for disinformation. So the first result was that the NSA basically, and the Department of Defense and the Cyber Command, had to close down all the sources and methods which were identified in these 1.5 million documents. It's a huge, huge process. Also, Snowden had relations with the Russian government, even before he went to Moscow. He met with Russian officials in Hong Kong. How do we know that? Vladimir Putin. He gave a press conference in Moscow on September 2nd, 2013, and explained that Snowden had met with, didn't give the number, of Russian diplomats, he called them, in Hong Kong, and based on the information they gave Putin, Putin authorized his exfiltration to Moscow. So basically, the whole thing starts with a Russian involvement. There are also 3 reasons to suspect that he had continuing relations with Russian intelligence. The first, when he got to Moscow, he was given a lawyer, Anatoly Kucherini, who is on the board of the FSB, the Federal Intelligence Security Service for Russia. Kucherini, 10 weeks after Snowden came to Moscow, gave a television interview in which he said that Snowden did not give all his material to the journalist in Hong Kong. He gave them only some. He brought some of the material to Moscow, and this material was previously or had not yet been disclosed. So, according to Kucherini, he had secret documents in Moscow. And just to clarify this, I went to Moscow, I spoke to Kucherini, who confirmed it for me. Okay. Secondly, in many ways more important, Franz Klintsevich, not a familiar name, who is the deputy head of the Duma committee, the Russian Parliament committee, that oversees Russia's intelligence services, made a statement on NPR saying that Snowden had shared his intelligence with the Russians, and added, he said, this is what intelligence services do, they get the information. Third, and I consider this even more important, the House Select Committee, based on US intelligence reports, stated that Snowden has been in contact with Russian intelligence services from the moment he arrived in Moscow to the present, which would be December of 2016. What puzzles me sometimes is the willingness of journalists to embrace the findings of US intelligence over Russian hacking and simply say they must be true because we have good intelligence, but to reject the same intelligence services when they say that Snowden's in contact with Russian intelligence. But we'll leave that aside. What we know about Snowden, to put this in context, is that he deliberately went after the NSA's sources and methods. The NSA, of course, could only exist as an intelligence service because it could protect its sources and methods. If someone knows what phone you're listening to, they then either disconnect it or use it to broadcast misleading messages. So you have to keep your sources secret. Snowden was working for a company called Dell, an outside contractor, but they didn't have access to the NSA's sources and methods. Another company, Booz Allen, one of the oldest and most trusted of the consulting services doing work for the NSA. They did. They had a contract which allowed them to work on material that had the NSA's most secret sources and methods. He switched jobs, and he said that the reason he switched jobs was to get access of the lists of computers around the world that the NSA has penetrated. In other words, their sources. He got them, unfortunately. The result, whatever he did with them, the result would be a little like, imagine a shopping mall, and all the security cameras are suddenly short-circuited, and so are the electronic checkout machines and whatever verifies people's tags on their clothing. Well, shoplifters would have a field day, obviously. Well, the same thing happens when the NSA is short-circuited. It loses its ability, or a large part of its ability, to see inside, in this case, Russia. According to the Wall Street Journal, the NSA was unable to detect in advance, which usually it would, the preparations for the invasion of the Ukraine in March 2014. So basically, suddenly an area that once they had an enormous amount of control of, they had no control of, and this is when Russian, and I have to say also Chinese, hacking into all our personnel files, our different systems for upgrades and renewal of intelligence clearance, it all happened. But there's good news. All intelligence has a half-life, all sources and methods. You know, they don't go on forever. And when you find out they're compromised, you look for new sources and you change the methods. I don't know whether this takes 5 years, 10 years, generations, I wouldn't know. But it happens. And there is good evidence now that we've restored a good deal of our capabilities if we can actually trace false flag operations, hacking operations, that have hacked into the Democratic National Committee and John Podesta's email and the Republican National Committee and other places, and trace them all the way to the Kremlin. It means that we have fairly good intelligence of what's going on inside Russia. Whether everything is totally back to normal remains to be seen. But the story that began with Snowden's flight to Moscow in June 2013 still is an ongoing story, and so we have to wait and see. So I'll take questions now as if.
So, thanks. Before we throw it out to your questions.
Oh, sorry about that.
Before we throw it out to your questions, I have a few questions for you, and I think we have a mic in the room, right? So if you could begin by sort of discussing, in one of the sort of arguments of the book is that it is at least a possibility, if not likely, that Snowden came under the control of Russia at some point. In one of your chapters, you break down 3 theories of when that could have happened. Can you discuss your assessment of those 3 theories, how they differ, and which you view as correct, or more likely to be correct?
Okay. You know, I actually started my investigation early in 2014. And when I spoke to people in intelligence, they had 3 scenarios. First scenario was that Snowden had been what we call a mole, been working for the NSA for the Russians, or for the Chinese, okay? Second scenario was that he was a whistleblower, or wanted to be a whistleblower, a wannabe whistleblower, who when he got to Hong Kong got trapped and the Russians took control of him. The third scenario is Again, he was a whistleblower. The Russians didn't get control of him in Hong Kong, but when he went to Moscow, they got control of him. So those were the three scenarios. And I went through them trying to see which made sense and which didn't make sense. As I investigated, I went to Hong Kong, I went to Moscow, I went to Hawaii, where he had worked his base, I went to Japan, where he worked. I traveled around the world twice on this whole thing. The first scenario didn't make any sense to me, that he had been a Russian mole, as I say in the book. The reason is, if they had someone inside the NSA capable of working on the Booz Allen contract, they certainly wouldn't allow him to go public to meet in Hong Kong with Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald, to contact them. At least that's my image of how intelligence services work. It made no sense to me. I mean, so I rejected that scenario. The second scenario was that Snowden started out just as he says he started out. He was disgruntled, you could tell that from his postings. He hated the NSA, as a lot of the technicians did, because what happened at the NSA in the 1990s is they basically became more and more reliant on computers. But they didn't have the people, technicians, to operate their computers. And they had budget restrictions. So they used a backdoor, which was outside contractors, which was sort of like temporary employment agencies or employment agencies, who basically got them the people, as cheaply as they could, and the profits, these outside contractors are all owned by private equity companies like Carlyle or Providence or whatever. And they're interested in the bottom line, so they get the cheapest people, because they only cost the people, so they get the cheapest people to do the work. And these people constitute now about 30 or 40% of the computer work at the NSA, maybe larger. They don't come through the military. They're not necessarily patriotic. It's a good job, paying $120,000, $130,000 a year. So Snowden was one of them. He was disgruntled. He thought he was smarter than the people above him. You know that from his emails. And he stole these files. Why he stole so many, I can't explain. Maybe someone advised him to. Maybe he thought it would give him leverage. And he went to Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, we know that he met with Russian diplomats. And Russian diplomats in Hong Kong mean basically Russian intelligence officers, because we know they reported to Putin. So we know the Russians now knew they had a prize. Whether they knew they had the keys to the kingdom or not, I don't know. But they knew they had a big prize, and they brought him to Moscow. So the second scenario makes sense to me, although it's also possible that they let Snowden remain deluded, that he was just simply going to Moscow, and from Moscow he would go on to South America or Iceland or something, but they never would have let him. Neither would we, by the way, if we had a Russian defector who had the keys to the kingdom, to their communications intelligence, and he came in here temporarily. He wouldn't leave very rapidly. So those are the three scenarios. I can't choose between the second and third, but I reject the first. So, as I say, what interests me as much as when Snowden was a key question, when Snowden became involved, in Moscow, I saw 6 former KGB officers, if that's not a contradiction in terms, as some people think it is. One had handled Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen. They were one had actually met with Lee Harvey Oswald in 1963. And what they all told me was a very interesting definition the Russians have of an intelligence source. They said that, Le Carré is fine, spies and moles, but it doesn't matter to them whether someone is their product, whether they place him in intelligence and groom him and nurse him and nurture him, or whether he voluntarily hates his agency, quits, steals some documents, and winds up in their hands. It's the same to them. They said if someone provides us with secret intelligence, we call them an espionage source. We don't make all these differentiations. And to them, to every one of these officers I spoke to, Snowden was an espionage source for Russia. So, I don't know if that answers your question, David, but...
It does. Can you speak a bit to the criticism that there's a lawyer who states that he saw Snowden destroy the documents before leaving Hong Kong?
Well, Snowden had 3 lawyers in Hong Kong. One was called Robert Thibault, who I interviewed numerous times in Hong Kong. And he said he couldn't discuss the case, and he certainly didn't say anything about his documents being destroyed in Hong Kong. Then in 2015, which is 2 years after Snowden left Hong Kong, the Sunday Times published an expose saying that Snowden had turned over codes about British intelligence that had led to agents being caught or something like that. I didn't put much stock in that report. It's not even in my book. But Thibault, when asked for a response, said, "Oh, I saw him destroy his daughter in Hong Kong, and I know that he didn't transfer it to the cloud or any place else." That was all in his statement. Well, I didn't put any faith in that statement or any stock in that statement either, because Thibault did not meet Snowden until 3 weeks after he was in Hong Kong. So he'd have no way of knowing what Snowden did during those 3 weeks. We know that he had external hard drives in Hong Kong because they were actually found by US intelligence, still encrypted, so they weren't destroyed. We also know that he transferred things to thumb drives, making a thumb drive for Laura Poitras and another one for Glenn Greenwald. The one for Glenn Greenwald didn't work, which is why they needed a courier. So what he says just can't possibly be true, and he wasn't in a position to know. He simply answered a reporter in a way that he thought maybe Snowden told him he did that, but he had no way epistemologically of knowing, because since he didn't know the person for 3 weeks.
So let's throw it open to your questions. Let's do over there in the back to begin with.
Hi, I'm Natalie Marichal from the University of Southern California. At the beginning of your talk, you referred to Snowden removing documents. What do you mean by removing exactly? Because to me, removing, you know, when you're talking, if you were talking in the Ellsberg era, that would be taking a piece of paper that would no longer be held by the agency. But that's not, I don't think that's what you're suggesting.
No, I mean, in this digital age, it's a good question. What does removal mean, okay? The logs in the compartments, just like they do in your home computer, when you highlight something, meaning you selected it, when you copy it, and when you move it, it notes that that's been moved. So what does remove mean? Remove means that he transferred it to another computer. This was the server. Remember, he didn't have a computer, he had a workstation. So he transfers it to the server. Then he takes it off the server, electronically of course, and transfers it to another computer. So they go to the server, they can, with their forensic tools, they can find out that the documents were transferred there and erased. So what remove means is they're gone from the server. They once were on the server and they're gone, so they're removed. That's what it means.
Okay, so I did understand you correctly. You're saying that Snowden deleted millions of documents from the NSA servers and retained the only existing
I'm sorry,
copies.
you put it better than I did, exactly. He deleted them to he deleted them, but he moved them to another computer when he had worked at Dell.
Okay, and your source for this is what?
The House Select Permanent Committee on Intelligence in their report.
I see. And is that the public report?
It's in the report that was in the declassified section of the public report, yes.
Okay, thank you.
So let's do right in front. There.
But you're right, I should have used the word deleted.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Michael Korp, a retired Foreign Service officer. I would be interested in whether or not you feel that Chelsea Manning took similar documents that are also potentially crucial to the safety of the United States, or if you think that her materials are somehow different than what you're talking about in
Well,
this
I think
report.
it's really night and day. Chelsea Manning, the documents she removed, many of them were marked sensitive, but they weren't communications intelligence. They weren't SCI, special compartmentalized information. They were basically diplomatic chatter and some military things. I'm not saying that makes her innocent. 7 years in a military prison is more than other people have gotten for similar offenses, 6 years, maybe 5, 6 years. So basically, I think that I actually think that Obama commuted the sentence out of compassion, and Snowden, who I have, if he went before a court and was found innocent, I would say fine. I don't have that much animosity towards him. But Snowden hasn't gone before a court. He went to Russia. So if you're saying why didn't Obama or Trump pardon him, the answer is no one has been able to question him. He basically had his own disclosure operation in Hong Kong, where he told Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras what he wanted to tell them and showed them the documents he wanted to show them. And all the other components of this mystery, what he did with the other 1,440,000 documents, why he went to Moscow, everything else. If he came back to America and was interrogated, he might very well we might find he's innocent or something, but not having gone to a court, I think, makes him in a very different position than Bradley or Chelsea Manning. Okay.
Let's take right there.
Thank you. I'm Tim Shorrock, an independent journalist. I wrote a book called Spies for Hire about the outsourcing of intelligence, so this Booz Allen's role in all this has been rather interesting to me. But a couple questions. One is, in that House report, which is slightly, there's some deletions in it, but it's pretty long, and it's been ignored by the press pretty much, I think. It says that the Pentagon went through all the documents, like you said, but the ODNI, the Director of National Intelligence Office, did not. And they have, in fact, they didn't really investigate much of the documents. That seems rather curious to me, why DNI would not and Pentagon would. I wonder if you have any knowledge about that or comment on that. And second, do you think that, is it possible there's another scenario to how
Is it possible?
Is it possible that there's another scenario about how Mr. Snowden was recruited? I mean, like he was in contact with hackers while he was at the NSA in Hawaii. There are these hacker clubs and that kind of thing. Maybe there was...
I understand. So let me try and answer both of your questions. As you say, and I'm glad you said it, the House Intelligence Committee report, which is 36-page long, parts are still blacked out, is very interesting. I mean, I'm a journalist and an author. But I don't have access, no journalist. It's a whole other universe to have actual access and actually be able to read this classified material. If only the Republicans had signed this, the majority, you know, maybe I would say, okay, they're interpreting this in their own way. But Adam Schiff from California, the head of a minority, ranking minority member, and all the Democrats signed it. It was also distributed, you know, throughout the House, Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi, everyone. No one has raised any serious question. So I agree with you. It's very odd that the New York Times, the Washington Post, everyone reports every statement Snowden makes or his lawyer makes in his defense. And here we get, these are self-interested parties, and here we get a bipartisan unanimous report that is basically a one-day story. And they cite his lawyer, Ben Wisner, saying and Bart Gellman saying it's a terrible report. Okay. By the way, I'm trying to see various members of the House committee, so maybe I can answer your question more thoroughly. But I think we have to take the report thoroughly. There are still parts blacked out, but I think they mention removed 3 times in the report. They mention the hard drives being found in Hong Kong in encrypted form in the report. They mention, most important, that he's been in touch in Moscow with Russian intelligence and still is. Okay, the second part of your question, I'm not sure I've completely answered it, but it's as much as I know. The second part of your question is, are there other scenarios? The answer is yes. Snowden gave, this is directly corresponding to what you asked, Snowden gave crypto parties, at least 1, maybe 2, in Hawaii. Now, I never heard of a crypto party, and I'm sure you haven't either. A little like a Tupperware party where you invite people to a location and you explain to them how they could load software to their computer. In this case, it was called the Onion Router, or TOR software, to defeat surveillance. It basically hides your IP, deletes it through a chain of other computers. And Snowden's co-host, Runa Sandvik, was one of the leaders of this entire movement. And it turned out that Snowden actually was running the Tor server, the largest Tor server in Hawaii. So he was part of this movement. And I went, by the way, when I was in Hawaii, I went to the place that he called the Fish Cake, okay, but where he held his crypto party, and I spoke to people there, and they all, you know, said about 20 or 30 people came, I guess looked a little like this room, and he demonstrated how it worked, and they said at least half the people were from the NSA. So this crowd was a crowd of, let's call them cyberpunks, people like Assange or Jacob Applebaum. They weren't there, by the way, but people that were very interested in opposing surveillance. They were like Snowden. So I see a scenario where Snowden became friends with them, which is why he held the crypto party, and he knew them all, and they egged him on and encouraged him and said he would be a great hero if he took these documents. I can see that scenario, and he thought that that's what he was doing, that he was being another Julian Assange or Chelsea Manning. And when he got to Hong Kong, he found that basically he was in a trap. He couldn't leave Hong Kong without being arrested and go to America or Europe. He couldn't stay in Hong Kong. Basically, the Chinese said he had to get out of Hong Kong by Monday. He left on Sunday. And the only place he could go The only people who wanted him were the Russians. So I can see that scenario very well, that he did start with these people. Assange did help him. He spoke to Assange when he was in Hong Kong on June 10th on the telephone, and Assange told him to come to Russia. He might have been coming to Russia anyhow. Interestingly, going to your question, Snowden said one of the reasons that he took the documents is because Chelsea Manning, then called Bradley Manning, had been so mistreated that was one of his motives. In any case, Assange then sent his deputy, Sarah Harrison, to Hong Kong to escort him to Moscow, and Assange set up a series of fake decoy flights, booking him on all sorts of flights to set up a smokescreen for him. So yes, he could have believed that he was working with a group like Anonymous or something like that. And there were other scenarios, but I'm open to them all.
So digging in on this question of intentionality, can you speak a bit about both to what extent do you sense that there was an intentionality to where he ended up in Russia? And also, if it was not intentional, did the U.S. make a mistake by so aggressively seeking to prosecute and shut down options, and in its past prosecutions of leakers and others, in creating the scenario where he would end up in Russia?
You want me to comment on Snowden's personality?
I'm wondering whether you sense that there is any sort of, whether it was intentional from the beginning or before to end up in Russia, and if it wasn't the original plan, or wasn't the plan until he gets to Hong Kong and finds himself unable to get to various other possibilities, whether the U.S. effort to so aggressively prosecute leakers shaped the conditions that led to him ending up in Russia.
You know, I really can't say or even guess at what was in Snowden's mind. I'll tell you why. I know almost nothing about the person except his posts, and posts can be misleading. You know, I did a book a long time ago on Lee Harvey Oswald, a detested figure, alleged assassin of Kennedy, hated. I found 109 people who served with him in the Marines, who went to school with him, who worked with him, who were his friends, who he met with in Dallas, and they all spoke to me. With Snowden, I found virtually no one who knew him. One guy who knew his girlfriend met him on a hike, and Snowden walked away from him. That's what he told me. So either these people, and with the people who went to the crypto party, when I tried to see them, they all said they're scared to death, they don't want to talk about this, and they don't know Snowden. So unlike anyone else, and I've written 18 books, I've never ran into a character. You know, he dropped out of high school in his first year, so he has no school friends. He dropped out of the military, and people that served with him in the military haven't come forward, and because of privacy laws, I tried, freedom of information, you can't find out who served with him in the military. And no one who worked with him at Booz Allen, except for his supervisor, who said that in March, he met with him. His name is Stephen Bay. He met with him in a Wendy's, and the guy seemed very interested in all these anti-surveillance technologies, like I mentioned, like Tor. And he hired him to work for Booz Allen, and he showed up at work second week in April, and he immediately got suspicious of him, but the guy kept disappearing, he said. He kept leaving. Maybe he was going to his other computer to download things. But I mean, it's a scandal, by the way, how little security for a person who just began working there, and he's asking questions about passwords and everything. And then he stops showing up, and he says he emails that he has epilepsy. and he needs to be tested for it, to be more precise. And this is on Monday, and then he vanishes. He's supposed to be in Honolulu being tested, and his supervisor can't find him. And he waits a week before he even forms security at his own company, Booz Allen. So, I mean, I think part of the story is really the privatization of intelligence, and that this is the antithesis of running, keeping sources secret when you outsource everything.
Let's take that question right next.
I just wanted to say that when I came in, this place was cordoned off.
Yeah, I know.
So I probably that's why there are so few people here.
You came in through Joe's restaurant?
Exactly, yeah. Which isn't my regular hangout, but they were friendly enough. I have 3 questions. One has to do with, you sort of ignore Snowden's libertarianism and
his what?
Libertarianism,
Yes.
his propensity towards Rand Paul, which would have gotten him into a very definite track of wanting to have the government far away from surveillance.
Right.
The second thing is that in the reviews I've read, they say you placed most of your confirmation that Snowden had something to do with the Soviets on Snowden's Russian lawyer who had Russian intelligence contacts, and that he confirmed to you that Snowden had provided material to Russian intelligence. Now, has that been confirmed publicly by this intelligence, by this lawyer? And the third thing has to do with your Oswald book, where you talk about a Russian conspiracy to kill Kennedy based on the KGB. You spoke with Oswald's handlers. Nobody presenting any of the documentation from Russia has presented anything to sort of substantiate the book you wrote of Oswald's operations for the KGB. So those 3 things.
Okay. Third thing is, I never wrote that Oswald was a part of the KGB. I don't know where you got that from, and I don't even know what book are you referring to?
Legend?
Legend, right. In that, I start off with an interview with Nosenko, who comes over, and in that book, I basically say that Oswald went to Russia. I say he came back and he shot Kennedy, but my theory in the book was always based more or less on Cubans. So I never say he met with the Soviet embassy when he was trying to get his Cuban visa. But if you find it, you find it, but it's not in that book, I promise you. But let me answer your first 2 questions, okay? Libertarianism. Yes, Snowden gave money to Ron Paul twice, which is a big thing, to send money. He was certainly sympathetic and a member of that. And I think that, one of the things that they are against is government surveillance. They're against too much government. That's the whole point. So yeah, I think that's an important part in its motivation. Yeah, that, as I said, we know he was disgruntled, and maybe I should have mentioned, he didn't like government surveillance. But let me get to your second, your second question, were my Russian sources. Well, I gave, you have his lawyer, you have a member of parliament. These are all public statements. You have Putin, and you have U.S. intelligence. Now, this is not the important part of my talk today, okay? Because the moment he stole that information, it was compromised, which damaged the capabilities of the NSA, whether or not he gave it to Russia. We will never find out, ever, any intelligence that's given to any intelligence service. They're not transparent. They have whole operations to keep what they know. They don't want you to know. There was a famous Mouse That Roared movie with Peter Ustinov where they said, they know you know. Well, we know they know you know. And it went on 20 times. So basically, I gave the sources why I believe that he was in contact with Russian intelligence, Putin being the first, Kucherina only said, he didn't say he was in contact with Russian intelligence. He said that he brought information to Russia. Klinsevich, who said he shared it with Russian intelligence. And the U.S. intelligence through the House committee that said that he was in contact with them. That's all I know, those 4 things. I don't know anything more.
Let's take back to the right.
Yeah, I'm Burt Wise. I was counsel to President Carter for oversight of all U.S. intelligence, and I ran the Church Committee investigations of the CIA. I have a question, but just preliminarily, in fact, your book Legend was not primarily based on your interview with Nosenko. It was basically based on your being spun by Angleton, and it definitely suggested very strongly that he was a Russian agent.
Nosenko.
No. Angleton, who, by the way, thought was your main source, and he thought Nosenko was a Russian spy. But with regard to the House Intelligence Committee report, the report was simply their rubber stamping the Intelligence Committee. They, unlike the Senate torture report, did no investigation whatsoever, and a lot of the members are embarrassed by it. But what I wanted to ask you was this. A number of reviews of your book, but particularly Charles Savage's review in the New York Review of Books, February 9th, and anyone interested in looking into this further really should read that, poked a number of holes in the book, as have other reviewers in the New York Times and elsewhere. And I see that, which is good, that you backed off some of the claims that you have made, like the claim in the book that there was a photo of him entering a hotel, entering the Russian embassy or Russian apartment, and other things. But a couple of things you've repeated here, and I'm curious why you haven't given up on those. One, most importantly, was your claim that Klinsevich, the Russian parliamentarian, had said that was one source for the fact that he gave information to the Russians. And that was taken from NPR. But it's been pointed out since then that, in fact, the NPR broadcast in English omitted language that's still in Russian on their site, which were the words in Russian, "I'm only speculating." So I'm sort of, in terms of how thorough your research was originally, or why, at least now, you went back off. One other thing in your book, there's a whole litany, but one other thing, you said in the book that he had denied being contacted by the Soviet intelligence, when in fact he testified in 2014 before the European Union that he had been contacted. And obviously, the Soviet intelligence or Russian intelligence would have contacted him. But he indicated that he had not had any materials, and he had minders with him, including journalists, and they've periodically contacted him, but not that they've debriefed him, which was your suggestion. So I'm wondering why you haven't backed off some of the other things that have been pointed out as counterfactual.
I haven't backed off anything, okay? You say these things based on a review, basically of Laura Poitras's partner, Charlie Savage, who has his own point of view. Well, let me just say what you said, okay, before many reviews. He basically truncated my sentences, or one sentence, to say the exact opposite that I said. What I think he meant by backing off is in the book, I say exactly what I said here today, that I didn't believe that he was recruited in Russia. He said that in a Wall Street Journal piece I wrote in 2013, I think it was 2000, I suggested that he could have been part of an intelligence operation from the beginning, which is correct. But that's not backing off. When you write a book, you change your thesis when you find information that contradicts it. No, I want to answer your question.
You misunderstood me.
Okay.
I was not talking about changes from your original, even stronger articles to your book. I was talking about some of the things you said in the book that have been
Okay.
demonstrated as
Thanks. Let's get the answer and take
Well,
some
but
more
I don't know
questions.
what you're referring to. I'm telling you, I haven't backed off anything in the book, so you have to say what you're talking about.
I just mentioned several.
Which?
The reference to the idea there was a photograph of him with Russians.
That's not in the book. That's not in the book. There's no photograph, mention of a photograph in the book.
There is a reference
There,
to his prior contact with the Soviets in Hong Kong, and the reference to the
So-
timing of the.
Thanks. Let's take a couple more questions if anyone has them.
you find the page where I mentioned the photograph. There, and what I did say is that Vladimir Putin stated on September 2nd that a 2-hour press conference or whatever it is on television that Snowden had contacted Russian officials in Hong Kong. That's all I said.
Do we have any more? Let's take in the middle.
My name is James Chung. I'm an independent scholar. You mentioned, sir, the privatization of intelligence service. That's exactly my question. What accountability that being held for these like Booz Allen? Because we know that James Clapper, the former head of the United States, was the head before he was appointed.
Booz Allen, right.
So is that appropriate for a guy who hires someone and with a huge damage to U.S. national interest, security interest, and nobody punished? As far as I know. So I like your view on this. But besides, the story was fantastic anyway. Thank you.
As you point out, there is a revolving door where people who are the heads of U.S. intelligence services then go to work for Booz Allen and in Clapper's case, come back. So we have that. And I wish I could answer you more optimistically, but I could find no penalty that Booz Allen suffered. And there was another case just this summer of a Booz Allen employee called Thomas Martin, who stole a great deal of material, terabytes, brought it home. No one knows what he did with it, maybe nothing. So there was some real issue about how do you enforce security to a firm that is a private firm. And the business plan, I looked at the business plan for Booz Allen, and the business plan is basically they can't expand the size of the contract. If they have a contract for $100 million, they can't go to government and say, let's increase this to 150. So the way they can make more money is by cutting the expense, and there's only one real expense, and that's the people they employ. So, you know, Snowden took a cut in salary to get his job at Booz Allen. And Booz Allen has continued, its contracts haven't declined, they've increased, and its profits have increased from its contracts. So I see that there's no penalty in the world of secret intelligence for failure. No one knows about the failures, and when they do know about the failure, they're so addicted, if I can use that word, to outside consultants that they don't know how to go back to doing it in-house. So yes, so I think it's a very serious problem, and I don't know if anyone's addressed that problem.
Any other questions? Bart? Let's do behind and then.
Sorry? So A few people here today and in various forums since your book came out have pushed back on a lot of the evidence that you use to support your claim, which is that Snowden at one point or another became effectively a Russian agent. And as far as I can tell, you've rejected all of those arguments against your claim. What would it take? What kind of evidence would you need to be convinced that your hypothesis is incorrect?
Well, if Snowden came back and stood trial, that would indicate to me that the Russians didn't have a hold on him.
Okay.
If, in espionage cases, as he's confessed on video in Hong Kong, that he did steal the documents, that isn't an issue. The issue of how many documents he stole and the quantity of documents, if there was a new investigation of the IC community, because you're quite right, the House report, I wouldn't call it rubber stamp, but was entirely based on the intelligence community, because that's what they did. They didn't have an independent investigation. So they reflect the intelligence community. If under Mike Flynn there was another investigation and they found that Snowden had only stolen 58,000 documents, then I would say my thesis is wrong. So, there are...
Okay, to go back to your first point, though, you said if Snowden came back to the U.S. to face trial, you would believe that he was
well, if
not a
he came back
Russian
to the
agent.
U.S. at all.
Right. Well, I mean, I think we can agree that if he came back to the U.S., there would be a legal process, right? Are you familiar with the legal argument that he would not be able to have a failed trial because of the specifics of the 1917 Espionage Act?
Well, the 1917 Espionage Act, this is not to answer your question, has been amended many, many times, so it's more modern. And it may be unconstitutional, okay? If he came back, and I'm not saying the trial would produce the evidence, the fact that Putin would release him, or Russia would release him, would be evidence that I'm wrong, that they're holding him as an intelligence asset, okay? The trial, I think he should stand trial for another reason, which doesn't really get to your question, and that is the ACLU thinks the espionage law is illegal. And it might very well be, I don't know. But the one way of testing it would be have him found guilty and then appealing it up to the Supreme Court, although maybe that's not such a good idea these days. But that would be the way that I think the ACLU should act. I think they should test laws, giving him a pass so he doesn't have to go on trial doesn't get us anywhere with the question you're asking. But, in this case, his word and his lawyer's words and his mouthpiece words are not evidence that would cause me to change my thesis, what they say, because he's a self-interested party, because he's the perpetrator of the crime, and he's currently under the control of the Russian government.
So
Do you
before
think he
we
could get a
finish-
fair trial under
what?
Trump? Do you think he could get a fair trial right now in the current climate?
He would, yes, I think he would get a fair trial, just like everyone else. 6 people were tried under the Obama administration. They all got a fair trial. If the law is wrong and the law is unconstitutional, then it's not a question. He would, be able to have lawyers and whatever. He would get due process. But whether the law is right or wrong goes beyond him getting a fair trial.
So thanks. Before we finish up, I was wondering if you have any concluding remarks, and in particular, if you can comment on looking forward for the next 4+ years. What's the impact of Snowden on our politics, and what's the impact on the security situation will be in your view?
Can I ask one more question?
Sorry, I think we're going to wrap up, and I'm sure he'd be willing to sign books and answer questions afterwards. Would you
like to? I don't mind.
Sure.
I have time.
No, I just had a specific one. What would be your explanation at least most of the damaging stuff he took, and we, in fact, don't know how many documents. They never said. They only know how much he had access to. But what he's given out, what people know about, is well known. What would be the Russian motive for keeping him for 40 days in the airport as opposed to giving him a Philby-type hero's welcome and so forth?
Again, I don't know Russia's motives, but I can give you two possibilities. Putin, we had very good relations with Russia in June 2013. There was a summit meeting scheduled with Obama for September. There were the Olympic Games, and our State Department and Obama himself and his national security advisor told the Russians that if you let Snowden in, it's all off the board, and it was off the board. So one motive for keeping him there might have been able to decide whether it was worth it or not. And a second motive is often, or almost always, with some exceptions, if you get a defector, you want to debrief him before giving him sanctuary, because he might turn out to be a lunatic, which happened with one other defector from the NSA, Victor Hamilton. So, but I can't answer that question. So, is that,
So,
anyhow, did you have a question? Or? Oh, okay, thank you very much.
so thanks. We have the books on sale outside. I'm sure Mr. Epstein will be happy to sign them if you'd like a copy. So, thanks.